Well, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Ted Gardner, and I'm an interviewer for the Public Library of Cincinnati and Hamilton County. And I have the honor and the pleasure of interviewing today Richard Slaughter of Cincinnati. It's the 13th of December, 2006. We're at the main library, and our camera operator today is Patricia Van Skake, and we're very pleased to have her, an old friend of our interviewers and interviewees. So Richard, where were you born?
In Cincinnati.
Okay. Where did you go to school when you started?
Carson School, Carson Elementary School in Price Hill.
Oh, okay.
Then I went to Western Hills High School.
All right.
And then I went to the University of Cincinnati.
Well, good.
Then I went to the Army.
Well, now that's a good solid start, isn't it? I should say. Well, that's interesting because we've had 2 or 3 others who got started in Carson School.
Is that right?
Yes, sir. And the names don't come to mind right away. I've interviewed quite a few, but Carson Elementary certainly sprouted a lot of fine young people, and we're just delighted that you're here, and were your family Cincinnatians?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So your roots go deep in the city here.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I should say.
My dad was actually in Ludlow, Kentucky, but he worked at Crane and Bree Casket Company, and eventually became the majority owner of the company.
Was that something that you got involved in eventually, or
No.
not at all?
No.
When you a person who I remember very well who went to Western Hills High School was John Schiff. Did you ever know John?
Well, in fact, I was in the same class with Bob Schiff.
Bob,
his brother.
Yeah, Bob
I
Schiff.
never knew John, but I did know Bob very well.
Well, John, of course, I'm a member of the Navy League of Cincinnati, and John was one of our great supporters and backers of the Navy League, and he was a great, enthusiastic Navy veteran of World War II, as you may well know. What did you do in high school? Did you play sports or anything, or what were your interests?
I was into everything.
I'll bet you were.
I played football, believe it or not.
Good for you.
I ended up with a reserve team, which went undefeated that year, but then I did not play with the varsity team in my senior year.
Right.
And then I went out for golf, and I wasn't good enough, so I decided, well, I'll go for tennis. So I played tennis, and I had my letter in tennis.
Oh, good.
And I was president of the student council. I was sports editor of the Western Breeze, which was a school paper. And if you were in it, I was in it.
Oh, that's terrific. And those days, pre-World War II days were so interesting because we were going through the Depression and all that sort of thing. Did you have any particular remembrances of the Depression days that you'd like to relate?
Well, I never had any personal difficulty from the Depression, but of course I remember it. And I remember going to bed every night saying that hoping prosperity will come around the corner, which was the saying that.
Absolutely. Happy days are here again and all that sort of thing, yeah. Well, those were interesting times, I should say. Then you were in the class of what, 41?
Yeah.
At Western Hills, and you were a JV Mustang on the football squad. And
actually, we were the Maroons at that time.
Oh, the Maroons. Oh, I didn't. Oh, okay. When did they change to the Mustangs?
It was right after I graduated, I think.
Was it? Mm-hmm.
But we were the Western Hills Maroons.
I'll be done.
I don't know why they changed.
What is a maroon?
Yeah.
Right. So then on to 41, okay, then you went right in at UC.
Went to UC,
And your studies there were?
aeronautical engineering.
Oh, wow, wonderful.
And I was there for 2 years, and then I was drafted.
Mm-hmm.
After I had gone to every flight board, the Navy, the Civil Patrol, the Marines, the Army, and all of them turned me down. Because my pulse rate would get too high, because I was so anxious to get in.
I know how you feel. I know how you felt. I experienced some of that myself. But, so then your opportunity, thanks to Uncle Sam, and Uncle Sam said, go where?
Fort Benning, Georgia.
Fort Benning, Georgia, infantry.
Well, I was in the Army Specialized Training Program.
Oh, yeah, ASTP.
Yeah, trained at Fort Benning, Georgia. And when that was, and then I went to University of Pittsburgh after that. And then they disbanded the ASTP. And I went to Indiantown Gap, and I was then assigned to the 264th Engineer Combat Battalion at Camp Pickett, Virginia.
That was some interesting, tough times too, wasn't it? Training and.
Yeah. One of the interesting things, since it's too long to put anybody in jail for it, my brother-in-law was a captain in the Air Force and had done his 25 missions in England with the 8th Air Force.
Wow.
And was training B-17 pilots at Langley Field.
Oh.
And I went down there on a cast, and he had a training flight. And his training flight was to take this lieutenant up and show him how to fly the B-17 on one engine. So we flew around a while, and I stood right behind Bud and the guy who was training. And he turns to me and he said, how would you like to fly?
Wow.
So he got out of the seat, the pilot seat, I got in it, and I flew the B-17 for about 15 minutes out over the Atlantic Ocean, doing turns. And so I think I am the only person who was not in the Air Force, was not a pilot, who has flown the B-17.
That's an outstanding experience. Did you get all 4 engines at that time?
I was allowed to use all 4 engines.
I hope so.
But he could keep that B-17 up with one engine.
Oh, that was a remarkable aircraft, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That Flying Fortress, good old Boeing. Yes, well, we've had some wonderful other interviews with B-17 people as well. And I interviewed a man last week out in Madeira who had had 35 missions and out of the 8th Air Force, and he was a very interesting gentleman. Well, so Richard Slaughter was there at Fort Benning. What came out of Fort Benning with you?
Well, just the basic training.
Oh, that was a basic training.
Yeah, now Camp Pickett, which is where the engineering battalion was organized, I was then sent to air compressor mechanic school at Fort Belvoir. And I learned how to take apart air compressors. And then so I ended up eventually being in charge of the air compressors for the battalion.
Well, they must have spotted a very strong mechanical aptitude in you. Did you feel that too?
Well, yeah, of course I was engineering training. And I worked at Wright Aeronautical.
Oh, you did?
Co-op.
Up there in Evendale.
Yeah. And so I had some background.
Sure. A lot of people don't realize that what we know as GE Evendale today, it started out as Wright Aeronautical back in the 1940s.
I was putting pistons on the Wright Cyclone engine.
Wow.
And one of the interesting things there was that General Chennault came through.
Did he really?
was kind of a morale boosting thing.
Yes.
How they loved to write aeronautical engines.
Right. Well, that's interesting because you mentioned that morale boosting thing. That was very typical in those days. They brought back heroes to the States to help recruiting and bond drives and all that sort of thing. Those were exciting times. I remember meeting a very famous Marine pilot by the name of Captain Marion Carl, who became an ace in the Pacific. Okay, so Richard, here we are. What was the next step? Did you leave the shores of good old US of A pretty soon after that?
Yeah, we did. It was in November of 1944, and we went across on the Queen Mary, which was another one of my interesting experiences, because out of all the troops that went to Europe, I think only 250,000 traveled on the Queen Mary, and I was one of those.
Oh, that's good.
And, we went across in 4 days.
She was a fast ship, wasn't she?
Yeah, I went down by Bermuda and across southern route, rather than going across the North Atlantic where the subs were waiting,
Gosh,
and into Firth of Clyde in England.
and didn't that ship travel unescorted?
Yes,
Just imagine.
but it weaved all over the place too. It kept in interesting motion while it was going.
I should say, and lights out at sundown and all that sort of
Oh,
thing.
yeah,
But
yeah.
show no lights, yeah. That must have been wonderful to travel on a famous ship like that.
Yeah, it was first class.
First
But there
class.
were 11 others in the same room.
How about that? That was a little crowded, wasn't it?
And we were serving KP
Mhm.
in the first class swimming pool, which is where the KP was. And we served 2 meals, one about 10 o'clock in the morning, which was a bowl of hard-boiled eggs, a bowl of bacon, and toast, and milk. And then about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we served bologna sandwiches,
Mhm.
and that was our meals.
Those were the meals for the day.
And the officers, in the meantime, were sitting at tables with linen tablecloths and flowers on the table,
Yeah.
eating steak or, well, anything that they ordered from a menu.
Just imagine.
So we were going into the kitchen, seeing this going on.
Sure,
A lot of the guys would pick up a steak for themselves.
of course.
I was the type that said, if they don't want me to have a steak, you know what they can do with a steak. So I wouldn't do that.
You didn't fall into that. I know that was a very common thing, and of course there was some resentment, you might say, depending on the individual. So 4 days across on the Queen Mary, and at that time, of course, she was still fairly. I think she was launched in what, 36 or 37, I think. And so she, by that time, 43, 44, she was still a fairly new vessel. And how many people did she carry? How many troops?
There were about 20,000 total on the ship.
Wow, that's a lot of people.
It was a lot of soldiers.
I should say so.
It's now burst out at Long Beach, California.
Yes, I understand she's, of course, I haven't been out to see her, but I understand that she's a very popular tourist attraction. And of course has a great record in history. And just think of all the famous and the infamous who have traveled on that ship in those days. Where did you disembark, Richard?
At the Firth of Clyde up in Scotland.
Scotland.
And then we went from there by train down to Nottingham, England, which is next to Rhine which is near, what the heck was it near? I don't recall. But at any rate, Ryan Hill near Crew. That's what.
Right, right. What kind of a base? Was this an Air Force base or Air Corps
Well,
base?
it was I think at one time it was basically Air Force, but it was a little bit of everything when I was there.
Right, right. So your duties there were?
Just training, and I was an air compressor. They were not building anything that they needed the air compressor, so I ended up being company clerk.
Oh, you did? Well, that's an
for that
interesting.
length of time.
Sure, sure. And that's a demanding job because you had to be able to type and keep records and all that sort of thing. And somebody was always looking over your shoulder, I'm sure.
Well, and the reason I became the company clerk was because they looked through all the records that anybody had and looked at their handwriting.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very meticulous when I made that thing out, so that's how I was picked for company clerk.
Good for you. You had a legible hand, huh?
Yes.
You weren't a physician.
I wish I'd have stayed as a company clerk, but it didn't work out that way.
So how long did you last as company clerk?
Oh, it was about 3 months.
Oh, is that so? And now this would be, what, 1944?
Yes.
44. Pre-Normandy?
Yes. No, I'm sorry, it was after Normandy.
After Normandy.
Normandy was in
June.
June,
Yeah, early June.
and this was November.
Okay, all right, fine. Well then, where did you go ashore in France?
Rouen.
Rouen?
Yeah, we went across, supposed to go across in a convoy, on an LST,
Right.
and the convoy took off without us because an Army barge towing or an Army tugboat towing a barge went around our ship, and of course the barge didn't quite go the same way that the tug went.
No.
So the barge rammed the side of the ship
Sure.
and put a big hole in it.
Oh my gosh.
So we just sat there while they welded a plate over the top of that hole, and everybody else in the convoy went across. So we crossed 3 days later at night by ourselves.
By yourself. Well, that was a little dicey too.
Yeah. And we disembarked at Rouen.
Uh-huh. And then what was your goal from there on?
Well, from there on, while we chased the Third Army up to through Eastern Germany. And I always said that I was 3 days late. And if I had to be in a war, I'd like to be 3 days
3
late.
days late.
Because I went through, I remember seeing, I was amazed at how many horses the German used. And we went through this one field that was full of horses, dead horses, and a few other dead people. And the interesting thing was these horses were on their back, and they had their feet straight up in the air. Well, wait a minute, I couldn't understand that. But we went through there, we went through the Saar, we spent the night in the Maginot Line, and we went through the Siegfried Line.
My goodness.
And then we turned north and went through Trier and Malmedy. Right, I don't know if you remember the Malmedy massacre.
Oh yes, terrible.
Well, we went out through there about a little after that happened. And
were you aware of that at the time?
yes.
You'd heard about it?
Yeah, one of our people spoke fluent German, and there was a young kid there, about 12 years old, that told him how he saw these soldiers all lined up in the field, 125 of them, and the Germans just machine gunned them down, or shot them down. And a couple of survivors, people who were able to fall a little in advance of the bullet,
Right.
and pretend to be dead.
Yes.
But other than that, why,
Oh.
that was the only knowledge of it.
No, that is a terrible, terrible, dark incident in the war, of which there were many, of course, but that particularly because of the the Nazi soldiers who had American uniforms
Yeah.
and were acting as if they were Americans to lure our boys into a trap and so forth. That was a terrible, terrible thing. When you speak about a youngster like that, was he part of the Hitler Youth, or was he just a native of the area?
Well, after the soldiers got in there was never any Hitler Youth. None of them knew what it was, somehow.
Right.
So he was just native in that area.
I see, I see. Did you ever catch up with George Patton?
Well, we got assigned to the 4th Armored Division. And we went through, from Trier, we went down to Moselle, and at the night of the crossing of the Rhine, I was on the Moselle River in charge of the air compressors, deflating the pontoons on the Moselle, which were being trucked up to the Rhine, reinflated, and then assembled on the Rhine River for the crossing just below where the bridge was still at Remagen, right below that.
So you saw the Remagen Bridge, huh?
Yeah, and we went across at St. Cole.
Okay.
And I was sitting in an interesting thing there was I was sitting in the cab of the air compressor, and it was night, and there was no lights on anything except one spotlight that was on the pontoon where they were deflating it.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a racket down the river, and these anti-aircraft shots went up, and they're like tracers, like you see in the fireworks in the 4th of July,
right,
go up and explode. And the plane came down there, and he was too low. It was nighttime, so I couldn't see the plane, and it was just happened in a flash of a second. But I could see these tracer bullets coming from the wings of the plane, and he was so low that the bullets weren't converging.
Mm-hmm.
And they went across my truck, and I was in the middle. I mean, they straddled my truck, and so they didn't hit me. But that was one of them. That'll wake you up.
I'll say. Well, the good Lord was with you for that. That's
I
for
decided
sure.
maybe the truck wasn't the place for me to sit and watch
I
it.
know. Well, you say here in your bio that you were sort of superficially scratched or wounded.
Yeah, and that, I can't even remember where we were at that time, but there was a bunch of soldiers that were fooling around, and one of them threw a bullet into the fire. And I thought that that's what exploded and hit me in the neck.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, but that's what I assumed.
Right.
And so I'm bleeding there, and the medics are taking care of me, and I said, well, we'll put you in for a Purple Heart. And I said, there was no way you're going to put me in for a Purple Heart. I got a scratch on the neck from probably friendly fire, and here's some guy that lost his leg, and he would ask me, how did you get the Purple Heart? And I'd say, well, I got scratched on the neck. So I refused the Purple Heart.
I understand, and that's the most honorable thing to do, of course, because we all know that there were people who took Purple Hearts for little or nothing.
Well, the thing that happens now is that when you apply for medical care under the VA program, they give you a list of about 6 items to list, and you get a rating according to those lists.
Yes.
So I was discharged with a disability for stomach ulcers of all things. After the war was over, I had a 20% disability. So that wasn't high enough, but a Purple Heart would have been. And I'd be covered by medical insurance from the VA if I'd have ascended to taking it. But
No, I understand, and I applaud you for your decency and your honesty. At this time now, you were about 21.
I was 19 when I was drafted,
Right,
and I was in for almost 3 years.
almost 3 years. Wow, that's a long time. It's a long time.
And I was there in Germany about a year after the war was over.
Oh, in occupation?
Mhm.
Oh, you were? That's interesting. Tell us about that.
Well, I got transferred. We were building a prisoner of war camp and using air compressors. And I was there with an air compressor.
Now, where would this be?
This was in, I think, Schadenberg or one of the Austrian towns.
Oh, Austria, okay.
And they came and got me. The chief comes up and says, "Get your stuff, you're leaving." I said, "Where am I going?" And they said, "Well, you're being transferred." I said, "Where am I going to be transferred?" And they said, "You're going to the 36th Engineer Combat Group Dance Band." And I said, "What am I going to play?" They said, "Well, your record shows you could play a violin, so you're going to play a bass." So,
If it's got a string, you're
it's
supposed to
pretty
play
good,
it.
I could play a bass. So I ended up in a big band.
Oh, gosh, that's great fun.
And playing over FM Munich and in the Bavarian Alps, and that was a real pretty nice deal.
Well, I should say I'm always interested in music too, and particularly the music of what we like to say our time, you know, the big bands and the swing music and the wonderful songs and everything. How big a band was it?
About 14, it would come and go. The leader of the band, I don't know if you remember Harry Babbitt, who was with
Sure.
his brother.
Oh, his brother.
Was the leader of our band.
Yeah, Harry used to sing with Kay Kaiser's orchestra.
And Gene was a professional musician in St. Louis. And he was assigned the responsibility for our band. And most of or a number of the people in the band were professionals.
Uh-huh.
And then there was me. And we were stationed eventually at Oberstdorf in the Bavarian Alps at a rest center there. But then we would travel back to Munich and play over AFM Munich.
Mm-hmm.
And then we would play at any dance or whatever that they had in the area where we played there.
Well, that was great fun, and of course not only were you enjoying what you were doing, but you were contributing to the morale of the troops and service people in the air.
And we would put on shows and theaters and play the music, and we got a wonderful reception from the troops.
I'll bet you did. And you were playing the bass, the bull fiddle?
Playing the bass.
How about that? Slap that bass, huh?
Yeah.
Oh, that's great, Richard. That's wonderful. I've talked to 2 or 3 other people who had some musical experience like that. And so there you were would that have been southern Germany or?
Yeah, that was in Bavaria.
Yeah, that was in
of course
Bavaria.
after the war was over.
Yes, right. And how long were you there? You said about a year after the war was
I
over?
was in Germany after about a year
Yeah.
after the war was over, but I was in the band about, I'd say 3 months
Mm-hmm.
probably before I finally was sent home. And,
Did you carry on your music after you got back to the States?
yeah, well, I didn't for about 60 years. I hadn't played a violin, and my son passed away, and his son out in California had a school program, and he went and got a violin. When he brought it back, or I went with him to get it, I said, "I used to play it years ago. I wonder if I still can." So I picked it up and I tried to do it. And I found out I could. But when I came home, I had to do something, so I started to play the violin again.
Oh, good.
And I was in a Baroque violin shop talking to the owner because the violin I'd gotten from him I didn't like. and I wanted to return it and exchange it for another one. And the fellow in the shop came up to me and he said, "How would you like to play over?" He said, I would like for you to consider playing with the Cincinnati Civic Orchestra.
Oh, yeah.
And I said, I haven't played a violin for 30 years, for 60 years, actually. My wife had never heard me play the violin. We've been married for 50 some odd years. And so I said, well, I thought about it. I got the director's name. And I thought, well, at that point I'm 79 years old. And if I'm going to do it, I ought to do it. I'd have to do it then. So I'll give it a shot. So I called the director and went down to the rehearsal. Walked in there, the director's wife comes up and she says to me, where's where we'd like for you to sit? And I said, well, I'd like to just look at the music and see if I think I can handle it. She said, oh, don't worry about it, I'll get your music. Just sit here. I'm in the second violin section. And so I didn't know if the assistant conductor was sitting next to me. The woman in front of me was the head of the section. And so the first piece we played, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony.
Wow.
And I have never played Beethoven's Fifth Symphony in my life, so I'm sight reading.
That's pretty heavy.
Yeah, when the intermission came, I was about ready to pack it up and go home. I thought, this is too much. And the fellow next to me, he said, you're playing magnificently well. I said, I don't think so. He said, well, I do. And the woman in front of me turned around and she said, it's amazing how well you do. And Ed Howard's fellow guy next to me, he says, you're supposed to get up now. I said, well, what am I getting up for? The director wants to introduce you to the orchestra. So now I'm hooked.
Yes.
So I played with the Civic Orchestra for about 3 years.
Oh, that's a wonderful experience.
And I'm now singing in a choir, so
Okay.
music I never got rid of.
I know, I'm the same way. I've been in the choir for 48 years in the church. But let's go back a little bit in Germany. Did you have any experience or see any of the concentration camps?
I was with the Third Army. The Third Army overran the first concentration camp at Orchard. And at the time it was taken, I was probably in Gotha, which is about 6 miles away. And about 3 days after it had been liberated, I went into the concentration camp.
You did?
Yes. And it was not a pretty sight. There were about 125 bodies there when I got there, and they had been moved up on a hill, and they were, every able-bodied German in the area was digging the graves for them. And I remember there were 3 American soldiers in the group. And I remember this one fellow, and he was spread eagle, like he'd been crucified.
Mm-hmm.
I said, how in the world are they going to bury him in a grave? He won't fit. And interestingly enough, they had a program on TV showing the Order of Concentration Camp, and they showed that individual.
Is that
and I
so?
told my wife, look at that. Remember me talking about that?
You were right there.
Yeah, and there was 2 Polish, German, or Jewish prisoners that ended up surviving. And what they did, they hid underneath the Germans took all the inmates out of there that were physically able to be moved, and there were 125 that they killed. Mm. And these 2 guys hid underneath the bodies. And our first sergeant spoke Polish, so he could talk to these prisoners, ex-prisoners, and they described the camp to us. And it was, as you go into the camp, there were 2 barbed wire fences. They were about 10 feet apart, with coils of barbed wire in between them. You go into the camp. And in the center of the camp was a cross where they would crucify. people.
Really?
And then there was a gallows to hang people. And the barracks themselves they held about 200 people, and they probably were about 50 feet wide by maybe 100 feet long, 200 people. There wasn't enough room for them to lay down, so they would take turns sitting down. And of course they were starving, but they were building a underground factory through the town. So they would march them through the town, and as they went through the town, the sport of the morning was throwing stones and seeing if they could knock one down, and which some of them they did. And then if they pleaded injury or sickness, they would pack them in snow without any clothes on. And they either froze to death or begged to be put back on duty. And if they did that, they were beaten to death.
Good.
So these people, the villagers, who said they never knew a camp existed, were the people that did this. The burgomaster, the mayor, hung himself.
Really?
Right after we were there. And so about not quite a kilometer away, you wonder what they did with all the bodies. There were about 7,000 people killed in that camp. And my figures may not be exactly right, but it was a large number. So you wonder how they get rid of the bodies. Now, at Buchenwald, they had gas chambers and crematories. Here, they dug a big pit, and they had two of them actually. They were about maybe 20 feet wide, maybe about 18 feet wide, and about maybe 24, 25 feet long, maybe a little longer. And they dug them they were digging an additional one right when the camp was liberated. They would put a fire with oil and wood in these pits. They had a narrow gauge railroad track. They would lay the people they wanted to cremate on these tracks and then lower with a crane into the fire. That's how they cremated. And some of the tracks were still there with the bones still sticking to them. And in the one that they were building, they had individual areas about 6 feet square for each inmate to work on. And in the bottom of this one pit, there was so much blood. There was about 6 inches deep. You would not believe the amount of blood that can come out of a person.
Goodness sakes.
And
terrible.
then they would take the ashes from their crematory and give them to the farmers to spread over their fields. These are the same people to know this place existed. So it was not a pleasant sight. Now, I don't have pictures of that. A buddy of mine had a camera, and he was in the liberation of Oberstdorf, of Buchenwald. I was not. I don't know where I was, but I wasn't in that camp. But I have the pictures that he took there from Buchenwald. And the upsetting thing to me, of course, is this talk now about, well, it never happened. Well, when I came back from the war, and I was up in Fort Wayne, Indiana with a bunch of college kids, and this one guy said, oh, that was a bunch of propaganda. I said, I was in the camp. I saw it. I took pictures of it. He said, you can very much told to say that. It's just amazing. First of all, it's amazing the depths to which people can go.
Yes.
And then it's also amazing that there are people who won't believe it.
Deny it. I know, you wonder about the mindset of people like that, you know, why Well, so you were there and you saw all these terrible conditions and so forth. Were there people alive in the camp?
Only those two
Only those
who
two?
had hid underneath the bodies.
Good heavens.
All the rest had been transported,
Oh, I see.
probably to Vision,
Oh, I see.
except for the 125.
Yes,
that was
of course it
sold.
did. Oh, my goodness sakes. Well, Richard, that's, I'm certainly sure that that's an indelible memory that you have.
The thing that you never forget
Yeah.
is the smell.
Yeah.
The smell.
Oh, my goodness, I'm sure. Terrible, terrible. Well, there was a, in the occupation forces, there was an agency or a department of burial and taking care of bodies and so
Yes.
forth like that. And is there an American cemetery nearby, do you know of, where our soldiers were buried? I know there are several in France. I just wondered if there was anything in Germany.
I don't remember that there was, at least at the time I was there,
Right.
there wasn't. We went, actually after the concentration camp, we went east as far as the Yobi Route, and we were stopped there, told that the Russians would take Berlin,
Okay.
and we sat there for 3 weeks. I mean, we could have gone on to Berlin, but
Of course.
we weren't able to.
I know. Did you see the Russians?
We didn't see them, but we saw the frightened Germans running away from them. They'd come in, Ruski, Ruski, Ruski.
Yeah.
And, you know, they would surrender to us
Of
in a
course.
minute before they'd go to,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, and then we turned south and went down into southern Germany. I ended up actually in Czechoslovakia when the war ended.
Oh, you did? Mhm.
Another interesting thing is in Hof, Germany, which is right near the border, Czech border, this biplane came over with the German insignias on it, and this guy throws a couple bombs over the side of this biplane. It was almost like
Like World War I.
World War I. It was unreal.
Isn't that something? For
Yeah.
heaven's sake, that must have been the last gasp or something like of the Luftwaffe.
Almost something to laugh at as long as they didn't land on you.
Well, of course. Oh, my goodness sakes. Yeah, that's, there was a movie came out in the last 6 months called Flyboys. I don't know if you saw that or not, but that was about World War I and that sort of thing. And of course, we've read about and seen pictures of the pilots in those rickety old planes and throwing bombs by hand out of the cockpit. Well, you have had some tremendous experiences. Anything else you want to relate to us about Germany or the occupation or?
Well, a couple of the other interesting things that happened was that as we were going north, when we crossed the Rhine, we went around Frankfurt and up the Autobahn towards Kassel. And we were to turn off of that. It was night, and it was raining. And it was muddy, we're right, and all 4 lanes of that Autobahn were filled with military traffic going north.
Right.
And tanks were around us, and they were in front of us, and throwing mud up on the windshield, and it wasn't raining hard enough to wash the mud off. So I couldn't see. I leaned my head out the window, and of course you know what that resulted in, but that's the only way I could see. And we had to, they had spotters ahead who would indicate by signs where you were to turn off.
Mm-hmm.
And we were obviously wanting to look at those, and it was a risky thing to not go where the signs told you to go. We were far enough away from the front at that time that there was lights permitted on the trucks.
Mm.
and the vehicles. There was no German Air Force inside. And after we turned east off of the Audubon, you come to what was, they called the light line, and there was an MT there that said turn your lights out. So from then on, we went blackout.
Right.
And the blackout, I don't know how familiar you are with the lighting on the trucks for blackout, but they're little, what we call cat's eyes on the back of each truck.
Yeah.
And if you were 75 feet away, it was one light. If you were 50 feet away from the truck ahead of you, there would be two lights. And if you were 25 feet away, you could see four lights.
Wow.
So that's how you kept your distance from the truck ahead of you. And you traveled that way.
In convoy.
And in convoy. And of course, we could see what appeared to be, you know, how heat lightning looks, only that was artillery fire, it wasn't heat lightning. And so we went east and that way. Another relatively interesting thing that happened, at night we crossed a pontoon bridge, and it was very difficult to see. And we finally got across. This fellow was riding in the truck with me. He said, I was afraid to say anything, but do you know you were riding on the top of the pontoon all the way over, on the edge of it? If I had gone 6 inches to the right, we'd have been in the river. So that was another little thing.
I should say.
But I had a number of things that have never happened to too many people. One was staying in the Mansion of Life.
Yes.
And that was a 7-story structure underground that the French had built, thinking that World War I was going to occur over again.
Right.
They had little pillboxes on top of the ground, but the structure itself was all underground. Had a railroad train ran all the way back to Paris, and the barracks, they had an ammunition section, they had a mess section, they had a sleeping section, but up on top where the real business was done, they had this little pillbox with a split in it for the machine guns. All the Germans had to do was go in between them.
Well, of course.
They couldn't. There was no coverage fire. When you went through the Siegfried line, they had pillboxes. Well, they had these, what they called dragon's teeth, which were concrete blocks like, and then barbed wire, and then I-beam type things that were structured to inhibit your travel. And a pillbox was covered by another pillbox, so that they were in depth and made it extremely difficult to get through. And we were fortunate, like I say, we were always 3 days late. We lost one man in the Saar Mountains with a truck that ran away and turned over, and he was killed. We lost 3 other men when they made the wrong turn, ran into a German machine gun nest. And one of them was killed, 2 were captured. The 2 that were captured, Germans put on the 2nd floor of a farmhouse, which was their headquarters. And they would at random fire through the floor at these guys. And when we got them back, the one had a complete breakdown. I mean, he had to be sent back and relieved of duty, which I can understand, but that's kind of the things that you see, you know. And then, of course, they had towards the tail end of the war, they had what they called you weren't allowed to fraternize, because at that point, when the Germans were starting to come out, when you first went in there, there wasn't a German in sight. I mean, it was like in Trier, when we went through there, it was like a death town. I mean, there was rubble and ruin, again, the smell. I mean, you talk about the smell of death. There is a smell of death.
Goodness sakes.
And so we went through that, and later on, towards the end of the war, you'd see these German soldiers in the woods. You know they were there, and they'd say, "Oh, the woods are full of them. Don't worry about them." And that was a fact at that point. I mean, the Germans had given up. And but when we first went into Germany, we were camped in the woods at night, and I heard a rattling of what we were told to dig foxholes, which was not an easy job. So some of us were a little lax about that. In the middle of the night, we heard this rattle of machinery, and going by, and found out the next morning that those were German tanks. And I thought, next time I'll dig that foxhole.
Dig that a little wider and a little deeper.
The other thing that interestingly that happened was a plane flew over one night and this anti-aircraft battery shot it down. And the parachutes are coming down, and we didn't know what was going on. We thought it was parachutes. But they were firing, this anti-aircraft company was firing machine gun bullets at these parachutes all the way down to the ground. And so we had to take cover to keep from getting hit by them. Well, it turned out to be an English plane. And they came into one of our headquarters, Company B, and they were a little upset at being shot down.
I'm sure. Hey, we're on your side.
Yeah, I remember we're friends. Not anymore, though.
Right, I should say. Well, there were some terrible mistakes made in that, in recognition, you know, and nervous trigger fingers and all that sort of thing. There was a lot of it that went on.
In fact, when you talk about recognition, what would happen was they would bomb on what was called the dust line.
Mm-hmm.
But if the wind, and normally the wind in that part of Europe is from west to east, so the dust line would creep toward the enemy. Well, it flew from east to west, it crept towards our soldiers.
Oh.
So they didn't fall. So we ended up having to put panels on top of our trucks that were red, so that hopefully they would see these panels and realize that they were American troops.
Right. Well, those were some very, very perilous times for you, and as you say, you were very, very fortunate that you escaped tragedy, personal tragedy. And of course, the interesting thing, Richard, is that your memory is so good and sharp, and you've kept that alive, which is important for history's sake and for whoever will see your tape, you know, and your family. I just can't thank you enough for your submitting to this sort of thing, and I also think that your musical experience, that's outstanding. I just love that. I'd love to hear about that. When you were in the band playing the bull fiddle, were you doing things like "Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree" and songs like that?
Well, we had all of Glenn Miller's music.
Oh, you did? You had the charts for Glenn Miller. Wow.
Well, we had copies of it.
Copies of it. Yeah.
So we had a file of music probably about that thick.
Wow.
And we would play all the Glenn Miller songs.
Sure, Chattanooga Choo Choo and all that.
And we were playing at an officer's dance one night, and this lieutenant colonel came up, and he liked this song Symphony. Well, we didn't have it. He wanted us to play it, and he was thrilled with Moonlight Serenade. He come down to the bandstand and start crying. And
oh my.
So he said, well, we're going to get the band transferred to the French Riviera so you guys can learn to play symphony.
Oh.
Great. We're ready.
You'll take that.
So the next morning he comes where we were billeted, and he said, you know, and we thought he'd forget about it. Yeah, he said, you know, I can't get you transferred to the Riviera, but he said, I'm going to transfer you to the Bavarian Alps, to Oberstdorf, in the Nebelhornbahn, and you're going to play there at the rest center. And he said, I think that you'll find that very nice.
Pretty good duty.
And so we got transferred down there, and we had chamber beds. We didn't have to make our beds, or clean our linens, or anything else. I mean,
Nice.
we played there Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday night, and other than that, they didn't care what we did. As long as we played good music.
Oh, I'll bet you did.
And we played, like I said, over Aachen and Munich. We played in the Hofbrau color, where Hitler used to make his famous speeches.
Right.
And it was
Did you get to do some sightseeing around the area?
well, we did it, but it was in the course of duty. I mean, I spent the night in Oberstdorf,
Yeah.
in Oberammergau.
Over Ammergau.
Yeah.
Very passion play.
Yeah, and that was an interesting night too. But we played a dance there,
Mm-hmm.
and then we saw King Ludwig's castle,
Oh, yes.
and a few things like that that were more interested. I was in the Eagle's Nest out in Berchtesgaden,
Mm-hmm.
and I have my picture taken up there, and that's one of the pictures that I left here.
Oh, good.
And so there was a lot of interest in.
Well, I should say, did you, speaking of Glenn Miller, did you know at the time that he had been missing?
Yes, and Sergeant Ray McKinley took over.
Yes, Ray McKinley. Wonderful musician.
Yeah, he was a very meticulous
Yes,
conductor.
that's what I heard.
Very hard to play for.
Uh-huh. Well, and of course he became very, very successful even after the war. He had his big band, and he conducted for years what was called the Glenn Miller Orchestra at that time. And you know the final resolution to the missing of Glenn Miller, don't you?
I thought that it was that he went down on the plane crossing the channel.
That's right, and it was, we're about to run out of time, but it was, the irony of it was that it was a returning RAF bomber that had not been able to drop its load in Germany because of bad weather, and was going to drop the bombs into the English Channel before they would land back in Britain. And there was a New Zealander aboard aboard this RAF plane, and he has reported, he swears it's the truth, that he saw this small plane way down below, skimming across the channel, and their bombs dropped, and that's most likely what killed, because there's never been anything found. Listen, we've had such a wonderful time. We've talked with Richard Slaughter, a wonderful Cincinnatian and a citizen and a musician and a contributor and a family man. And we thank you so much, Richard, and God bless. And as we always used to say, keep them flying.
Well, thank you very much.